You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It is always a pleasure to be back alongside with you, Eugene Puryear.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, and of course, very happy to be back with all of you viewers, or maybe listeners if you're doing something while you're watching this, but nonetheless, if you're in the sound of my voice, very happy to be with you here on the show. We've got another great show for you, as we always do, going all around the world, touching everything from climate justice to conflicts in Europe to ongoing issues with the Cuba blockade, things happening in Northeast Asia, Gaza, Lebanon. So we're going to hit a lot of things. We'll probably hit even a little bit more than that. So action-packed show, plenty of things here, which is why it's a good time for me to remind you to go ahead if you're watching on YouTube and hit subscribe, then hit the bell for the thing so you can get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to, because like we have a lot of issues that we cover on this show, we're covering a lot of different things here at Breakthrough News. You got a lot of great content coming out all the time, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. So of course, hit the bell so you get the alerts for what you have subscribed to. Subscribe. And if you are watching on Free Speech TV, just a big shout out to you. You don't need to do anything else. Just keep watching. And as always, big salute to the FSTV team for making it possible for us to be coming to you via that platform as well. So as we get ready to start the show here, Rania, are there other things you would like our viewers to be aware of?
In fact, there are, Eugene. First and foremost, I want to remind everybody to please like, subscribe, and share. Especially like. That helps boost us in the algorithm. Smash that like button. And moreover, you can help support Breakthrough News and all of our journalism here, because we are an independent media outlet that depends on your support, by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And for as little as $5 a month, though there's no limit to how much you can spend, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like this very cool Breakthrough mug. Very cool. We both have one. You can too. But more importantly, by becoming a patron, you will be helping to participate in independent media that is not in bed with pharmaceutical companies and Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all the other weapons companies that help influence the sort of imperialist narrative that you see everywhere else. And for those who just want to do a one-time donation, you can do it in the live chat. You can also go to breakthroughnews.org and donate there. And yeah, that's my spiel for the day. But I will be coming back less kindly to yell at people if they have not liked the show. I'll throw that out there.
Yes, well, listen, you pay very close attention, which means you must be paying close attention to the chat, too. So if anybody is saying anything, untowards, we're making a list and we're checking it twice like Santa Claus. So just remember that as you type your comments. Rania is always watching, whether you're liking it, what you're commenting on, all these various things. There's a big brother aspect to our, listen, it's whatever, however you want to do it, I'm going to support you.
I am watching. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I'm watching.
It's a panopticon. There's no doubt about that. It's the 1984 of chats. This is why we have to start the show relatively quickly after it starts, because you can see that Rania and I can really get carried away if we're allowed to. So we're not going to get carried away. Rania, as you mentioned, of course, we are not being funded by any big weapons contractors or pharmaceutical companies. We're also not being funded by any oil and gas companies either, which is a direct segue into our first story. You may or may not be surprised to hear that big oil is striking back at those they believe are making it harder for them to do great harm to the planet. Some serious free speech issues that are stemming out of the Standing Rock struggle that many people may remember around the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. Energy Transfer, the big company behind that, now suing Greenpeace USA and Greenpeace International, making a range of claims about what they claim was happening vis-a-vis the Standing Rock struggle. But I think with some broader implications for the overall movement, certainly for climate justice, but I think, many other important issues where people are using their First Amendment rights to speak out. So to break this all down for it and to get into all the implications, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Charlie Cray, who is a senior strategist with Greenpeace USA. Charlie, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us on. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. Wish it was under better circumstances, but certainly an important story we want people to know about. I saw it in AP. I don't know how many people have even seen the story. So maybe to start, Charlie, I mean, what is Energy Transfer alleging Greenpeace did? What is the nature of this lawsuit?
So Energy Transfer is suing Greenpeace, as you mentioned, Greenpeace US and Greenpeace International for $300 million. And essentially it boils down to a conspiracy narrative that they are alleging that Greenpeace led the Standing Rock protest, orchestrated it, and that the statements Greenpeace made ruined their reputation and were used to interfere with their business by, for instance, influencing banks to pull out of the project.
Well, I'm curious if you can tell us about the use of these SLAPP lawsuits, the strategic lawsuits against public participations to silence dissent by these corporations. It's a growing trend. It's one way to explain what Energy Transfer is doing to you. So why does this matter? Why should people care?
Right. So these lawsuits are basically designed to intimidate organizations and individuals. And I should add journalists, human rights activists, and others. The oil and gas industry is one of the biggest perpetrators, one of the biggest bullies in using this. But we've also seen other sort of billionaire bullies use it. I mean, Elon Musk, for instance, filed a SLAPP suit against Media Matters. Donald Trump has used SLAPP suits. It's part of a big toolbox to attempt to dismantle activism and, frankly, dismantle democracy through the courts and other means. So SLAPPs are often not just filed against organizations. It's cost us millions of dollars to defend ourselves, but they go after individuals. They go after smaller organizations. And it's really quite intimidating, and it can silence people, force them to reach settlements that they otherwise wouldn't. But overall, it's essentially an attempt to muzzle and divide movements.
I'm glad you raised the issue of dividing movements too, because it seems like one other issue at stake here, and you sort of already alluded to this, is the suggestion that Greenpeace was sort of behind the scenes puppet mastering what was happening at Standing Rock, which of course, for those of us who remember, certainly is not the right narrative. But I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit as well, because I think that's an important factor of how they're trying to also rewrite the history of what took place at Standing Rock and what it meant for indigenous communities.
That's right. So you're right. This is a racist rewrite of the history of Standing Rock. And one of the claims in the case is that Greenpeace can be held liable for the actions of everyone who was at Standing Rock. Greenpeace had 6 individuals over the course of the protests that involved 100,000 estimated people. And as you probably recall, and many of your audience will recall, this started at the grassroots level and the tribal level at Standing Rock, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And it was a response to a company that basically would not listen to their views and proceeded to lay the pipeline. And they made a call out to their allies and other tribes. And over 300 tribes had representatives at Standing Rock. And our folks didn't even show up there until long after the camps had grown to become quite large. The resistance had become quite large. And part of the allegations here that I think aren't just an existential threat to Greenpeace, but to the movement, is that they are trying to lay not just pipe, but legal claims. They're trying to lay precedent that Greenpeace can be held, again, accountable legally for the actions of others. And there were people there, for instance, who damaged the company's equipment and so forth. What they're trying to suggest is that Greenpeace can be held accountable because Greenpeace was invited to come in and do de-escalation training, nonviolent civil disobedience training, and so forth. So they're concocting a conspiracy without any evidence against Greenpeace.
It's really insane when you think about it. I mean, a $300 million lawsuit. So this is a way to also immediately threaten an organization like Greenpeace, or literally any organization that steps in to be involved in any way, no matter how legal, with protest activity against these massive oil giants, or really any corporation in the country. But, beyond that immediate threat to Greenpeace, you mentioned setting a precedent. So I want you to elaborate a bit on that. What are the broader legal and political implications of this case? Because when you talk about setting a precedent, this would essentially allow corporations to more aggressively weaponize the courts against activists, against journalists, against advocacy organizations like Greenpeace, not just by trying to bankrupt them by suing them, but beyond that. So yeah, could you elaborate a bit on that precedent you're talking about?
Right. So, Greenpeace is an organization. We are an easy target when you're talking about a mass mobilization, a mass movement. And what they're trying to do is divide the movement by picking off identifiable organizations and holding them liable. They claim that Greenpeace should be held liable for all of the extra security costs, all of the delayed construction costs, and so forth. The implications of this are similar in a civil society case in the sense of a corporation being able to weaponize the law against activists, similar to what the government tried to do in the McKesson case down in Louisiana, where one individual who might obtain a permit and organize a protest could allegedly be held liable for the actions of others. That was a famous case that they've tried to mount and were unsuccessful.
No, I think that's an important point, and it almost raises another issue. I'm glad you brought up the McKesson case, because it makes me think about movements in the context of this and what we're talking about. And it seems that one element of this also maybe this is not the right word, but somewhat heartening, because if it wasn't making any difference what people were doing, it seems they would not be going to great lengths. So this also seems to speak a little bit to the successes of the climate justice movement.
Absolutely. I mean, and the success of the indigenous rights movement. Standing Rock was the largest indigenous protest in modern memory. And we were invited in as allies, and we didn't lead that protest, as we mentioned. But yeah, this is, we all know where the science is on climate change, and we need to stop the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And everywhere there is frontline, fence line resistance, the activists are putting their bodies on the line or otherwise trying to stop these companies. And it's not just slap suits. We're seeing anti-protest laws, what they call critical infrastructure bills, that criminalize people for trespass. There's already laws against things like trespass, but they're trying to up the stakes, treat activists as, in some case, even treat them much like they were terrorists. And I think this is a worrisome trend, especially in the era of Trump. We're getting the, big billionaire bullies and weaponizing all areas of the law here. So it's a real disconcerting trend. But here we have a corporation run by a billionaire taking Greenpeace to court and alleging, basically has said that they want us to pay for what happened at Standing Rock.
Can you talk a bit about what it is that Greenpeace is doing to fight back against this? I mean, you're obviously going to court. Proceedings are happening now.
Sure.
So Greenpeace isn't taking this lying down. And I think it's really important for people to understand that there are things that perhaps they can do to try to push back against this sort of thing. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Rania. We have a website, greenpeaceontrial.org, where we have calls to action. People can sign petition. There's an organizational letter that we have nearly 500 organizations that have signed an open letter to the company to essentially say we stand with Greenpeace. We have a series of webinars tonight. In fact, for your listeners listening live, we have one where we have guests from Standing Rock explaining the history of DAPL, the true history of DAPL, and we'll be giving a legal update as part of that. And that's a weekly briefing series that'll happen through the course of this trial. The trial lasts 5 weeks. And I should say, no matter what the outcome of this trial, we're going to survive. You can't sue a movement. That's what these people don't understand about this slap case. We will be around in whatever form or fashion. We will be able to appeal this lawsuit, if necessary, to the state Supreme Court. So we're not going to be intimidated. That's part of the whole intention. And we're inviting people to stand with us in that regard. We're winning in the court of public opinion. If people look at the coverage in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, elsewhere, the story is being told largely the way it is, that this is an attack on free speech, the First Amendment right to speak and right to assemble, as people do in big protests. And we will not be intimidated by this case. And we appreciate all the support we've gotten.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on. And listen, I think movements have always faced this and always been able to stand up. I think that's a great point. You can't sue a movement. Charlie Cray, senior strategist with Greenpeace USA. Really, really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I'll say, Rania, one notable factor about this when we think about Standing Rock and you think about, how absurd it is that they're singling out Greenpeace, because there are lots of people there. One of whom, by the way, who had many very choice things to say about energy transfer is the current director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, but they're not suing her. So obviously it gives you a sense of what's really happening there. But, it was such a momentous, I guess it was 2017 moment. And the fact that they're now coming back after all this to try to take out Greenpeace with a $300 million lawsuit just shows that they are fearful, I think, of, when you look what happened there. I mean, ultimately they did get the Dakota Access Pipeline, but, Line 3, Mountain Valley Pipeline, I mean, every one of these big pipelines is facing huge and significant resistance, all over the United States. So obviously, they're making a lot of money, but I think they're feeling a lot of fear.
Yeah, and I just also want to note that this is definitely a bipartisan problem. That is unfortunate in the sense that there's nobody in a position of power who cares. Because they're all bought and paid for by the same people at the end of the day. Yeah.
Well, you remember.
It's really.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, you remember how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's whole thing against Trump was, we've approved more oil and gas leases on public lands than any other president in history, which, it's just interesting because they also said they were the best climate people of anyone in history. So it's sort of like you can't really have your cake and eat it too there. Either you're the best climate people or you're not. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out a little bit. Deb Haaland, who is the Secretary of the Interior, who, I will note, really made history as the first Indigenous woman to be in that position. But she's getting ready to run for governor of New Mexico, which is one of the biggest oil and gas states. And obviously the Republicans are going to make a huge deal about how she's going to come in and shut down all the oil. So it'll be interesting to see, again, the record of the Democrats, contrasted with those who are getting the raw end of the deal on many of these mineral resource extraction contracts. But yeah, interesting story, unbelievable issue. Quite frankly, I cannot believe they're suing them. But this happened, I think, a couple years ago in the UK. I don't know if it was Energy Transfer. I think it might have been Shell sued Greenpeace UK and also Greenpeace International in a similar way. Ultimately, it ended up getting settled because so many people in the UK were like, this is the dumbest thing we've ever seen. But, I think it is dangerous. And I think especially the trespassing and all those other things that Charlie mentioned. I mean, you look at some of these critical infrastructure laws that he referred to, it's like you step on the land and you chain yourself to a pipeline and all of a sudden they're treating you like you put, Simtex on the pipeline and blew it up or something. So, the whole, it's completely, it reminds me of people who go against nuclear weapons, like these Quakers, women or whatever, who would be 70 years old and go over a fence and hold up a banner and then they get 20 years in prison for endangering national security or whatever. So it really is completely absurd on so many different levels. But here we are.
Totally. Well, I just wanted to say, if Tulsi's watching,
Tulsi Gabbard, if you're watching,
where are you at, Tulsi? If the Tulsi Gabbard was
and if you remember,
she was there. It was a big thing for her.
It was a huge thing for her. She actually rode in on horseback with all those veterans and made a huge entrance. I mean, it was a major part of her launching her political profile and career. She was supporting Bernie Sanders. She resigned from the DNC. I know she's changed some of her views now, but I just think it's notable because we'd have to go back and look, but I'm assuming many of the things that they are accusing, and I'm saying accusing because I don't believe it's true, accusing Greenpeace of might be things that she could be accused of too. But I guess when you are in high positions, these kind of things go away. But either way, we'll have to see. Well, let's turn to another critically important issue, and one that actually does, in fact, involve the Trump administration quite a bit, and that is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and I guess the possibility that it could end relatively soon, which is what a lot of people are talking about. Critical minerals, there's a lot of different pieces to it. So to sort through all of this, we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Glenn Diesen, who's a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and the author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Glenn, thanks so much for being back with us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me back on.
No, well, very, very happy to have you. And I guess here's where maybe I will start is, do you have some level of hope that the United States and Russia can negotiate an end to the war? I mean, it seems obviously, the Europeans are hemming and hawing. Zelensky at least claiming that he won't sign anything that he doesn't participate in. But it does seem like the principles in some ways are the U.S. and Russia. So do you feel recent negotiations give us cause for hope, or perhaps, we should wait a little bit more to see how it pans out?
No, I think it's good reasons to be optimistic. Indeed, just the rhetoric coming now from the Trump administration, despite all its faults, I think it's been quite rational on many of these issues, and I think the key point here is if you want a peace, one have to address how the war began. But the Biden administration and most of the Europeans, they more or less refuse it. They lock themselves into this idea that Putin is the new Hitler. So I think if you want a peace, you have to realize what started the war. And the war started with NATO toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014 and pushing for expansion. Now, for the Russians, this was always unacceptable, and this is considered an existential threat. So that's why they invaded as well. They want to impose a neutrality on Ukraine, and this is necessary to get an end to the war. So the fact that Trump now comes along and says NATO is off the table, this is what started the war, this is a bit shocking to the Russians, because they never heard anyone in the West wanting to recognize any of their security concerns. This is a wider problem we have in the West, by the way. They don't recognize security concerns of any of our opponents. But the fact that Trump has now said there will be no NATO expansion, it's unrealistic to get all the territories back, and there will be no security guarantees from the US. This, I think, has been the foundation of what a peace agreement has to include. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, Glenn, it's super interesting also to just watch Trump attack Zelensky specifically, demand Ukraine's resources. We'll see, I guess, how that turns out. It's also just been interesting to see someone like Marco Rubio, who was a huge anti-Russia hawk, be the one having to go around and sell this. Just coming from him, it looks strange, I guess, but that's where we are today. But you also, I think it's important to also note something that you argue is that the U.S. is now pivoting away from Europe and seeking this end to the war in Ukraine to actually weaken the Russia-China alliance. It's part of that pivot to Asia. So I'm curious, what signs do you see that Washington is perhaps shifting its priorities? And how might this impact both the war in Ukraine, but also this global sort of geopolitical shift to focus solely on the war with China?
Yeah, well, I understand and don't disagree with the main thought behind this, because after the Cold War, the United States imposed this or pushed this security strategy based on global dominance. That is, it should dominate every corner of the world, which meant that it wouldn't have to take into consideration the security concerns of other great powers, simply because no one could even be in a position to challenge the US. I think, interestingly, Marco Rubio was the one who said in an interview with Megyn Kelly that this order has come to an end. The entire post-Cold War order, that is, the world is multipolar now. So you have many centers of power. And if the US continues to try to be dominant in every part of the world, then it will exhaust all its resources, and the main great powers will balance the United States. That is, they will all come together to put a big check on the US. So this is not in America's interest. So I think it's a good idea for the US to adjust to the realities of the new world. And what this means is it has to have some priorities above others. The US now appears to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, as we've seen with Trump's bit, I guess, aggressive approach to their own backyard, and also shifting more towards Asia. But a key region which is not a priority is Europe. you want to pivot to Asia, you have to pivot away from somewhere. And again, that is Europe. So if you want to get out of Europe, you also have to get out of Ukraine. So a lot of this makes sense. I'm not quite comfortable with this taking the natural resource of the Ukrainians in the weakest time. But the overall strategic picture of what they're trying to do, it's a good idea. I think the world is no longer Eurocentric. It's indeed the Europeans, they're becoming largely more and more irrelevant. And so I think this is it's a necessary push away. It's just usually Trump colors it with this very bombastic language, and it results in many people focusing on his, I guess, unusual personality and a bit vulgar, vulgar language. But the strategic idea behind it does make a lot of sense.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the Europeans being relatively irrelevant, because I wonder what you make of this idea of European troops in Ukraine as quote unquote peacekeepers. I mean, I know Trump is saying that now from his conversations with Putin that maybe the Russians have some level of comfort with that. But I mean, it seems, you know, just sort of technically and logistically not that feasible. I mean, politically, whatever it may be. And I wonder how real you think that is, or how much you think that's an attempt by various EU nations to just stay in the conversation about what the final outcome will be here.
Yeah, they want to be involved, but also the Europeans want to be involved in order to sabotage the peace. And I think it's been quite evident by what they're pushing, because not only do they want to be a part of the conversation, but they're very explicit that they want these security guarantees. Now, security guarantees sounds wonderful. And indeed, I can understand the insecurity of Ukraine, why they would want a guarantee, even to deter Russia. But security guarantees is also something that would pull in the Europeans and then potentially also the United States if conflict would start again. Now, this is the worst thing you want in a peace agreement, one which creates incentive for restarting the conflict. That is, if Ukraine wants its territories back, all it has to do is restart the conflict, and then it will have the Europeans and Americans on its side, which could escalate quickly into a nuclear war. So I think this is a very bad deal. I think also Trump understands this. Now, what the Europeans want, though, they want as Macron said in his meeting with Trump, they would like, yes, a ceasefire, and then we can start to discuss the political settlement. But I think this is also nonsense, because we've done this before. In the Minsk agreement of 2015, which lasted until 2022, we did the same. We had a ceasefire, and then we're going to implement the political settlement. But instead of implementing it, the Europeans and Americans just pumped in a lot of weapons into Ukraine, built a large Ukrainian army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And by changing realities on the ground, they never had to implement the political settlement. So the main two negotiators and guarantors of this deal, which were the French and the Germans, they even admitted that the Minsk agreement was just to buy time to build a Ukrainian army. So it's so to try to sell this back into with the Russians, that is that somehow now we're going to do the same thing, another Minsk agreement, where we just freeze the front line, and then the West going to start to rebuild the Ukrainian army so we can fight the Russians again another day. It's simply not going to happen. So I think, Starmer, Macron, they go to Trump, they bring out all their best flattery, how great he is, and yes, we want to come here and support you. But the way I see it, they're trying to poison the deal, which Trump has been trying to push forward.
I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the Europe angle here, in the sense that, you know, you had the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, and I mean, I still can't get over the fact that the head of the conference actually started to weep on stage as he was expressing how horrible it is that the U.S. is stepping back from Europe. It just seems that, you know, even as the U.S. wants to kind of step away from Europe after essentially forcing it into this militarization of NATO, further militarizing itself, provoking this war with Russia and Ukraine, blowing up that pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline that totally screwed over to the Germans. I mean, and on and on and on. Essentially, you know, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder against the Russians. After all of that, the Europeans are sitting there begging the U.S. to continue. It's just kind of a sad thing to watch. But, you know, what does it mean about the future of Europe and how the U.S. sees Europe and whether it has any actual sovereignty?
Yeah, no, these are all good points. This was the United States who initially pushed for this hegemonic order, which entails expanding NATO and ignoring Russian security concerns. This is what started these tensions to begin with in 2008, which is when the seeds of the Ukraine conflict began by promising future NATO membership for Ukraine. The Europeans, they thought this was a disaster. Again, the German chancellor said this would interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war, but still they bended a bit to Bush's demands at that time, and yeah, set us on a path to conflict with Russia. And again, I find it a bit interesting that Trump now portrays that America has done enough to help, but again, the United States was very key in toppling the government in Ukraine 2014. It was the one who started this intelligence operations. That is, the CIA went in on the first day after the coup and set up this covert wars against the Russians. They're the one who supported sabotaging the Minsk agreement for 7 years, then sabotaged the Istanbul negotiations in 22. So for it to now come back and say, well, we did everything we could, this is Europe's problem. It's I can understand why the Europeans would feel a bit betrayed on this. But this being said, the Europeans, at least in the past, they used to, during the Iraq War, they were able to stand up to the United States sometimes when they thought the US was too aggressive. But since then, the Europeans have been quite spineless. But now we see suddenly the Europeans are building up courage to stand up against the US, apparently, but because the US wants to end the war. So you have the new incoming German government who wants to form a closer partnership with the French and the British so they can collectively try to prolong the war in Ukraine. So it's a strange time to, wanting to challenge the US, but it's no, it's just extraordinary that they want this war to continue to begin with, because this war is making the EU so incredibly irrelevant. As you said, when there's this much security dependence on the United States, the US can convert this security dependence into demands for political and economic loyalties. They can blow up Europe's entire energy infrastructure, and the German president gave a medal to Biden, which is extraordinary. They had all this sanctions, if you will. No, not sanctions, subsidies to transfer all these German industries over to the US. So, and again, they did nothing, and now they put themselves in a very, very vulnerable position.
I'm wondering how you think the issue of Zelensky's leadership could impact the possibility of signing an agreement. I mean, obviously, the Russians have raised the issue that they don't view him as totally legitimate because of the pushback he gave to Trump. Trump has also been undermining him. I mean, it seems like polls are shifting. There's some other candidates who seem to have some popularity. I mean, do you think that some sort of election or some sort of other leadership transition will be a required element of being able to reach a final solution, or if it's maybe more of an atmospheric issue?
No, I think it's probably necessary with a different leadership because, Zelensky, he kind of painted himself in a corner. He's been very adamant that he doesn't want to make a peace, and if it's too difficult, then the US and the Russians might prefer if he's replaced with someone else. If you see, for example, his former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, he's now a presidential candidate. If he takes power, he already said that this horrible deal on the table is the best deal Ukraine will get. And he's actually blaming the Europeans for not allowing Ukraine to end the war. So what I'm thinking, if Trump has a deal, and the Russians can agree to this deal, and they're pushing it, and Zelensky opposes it, then I think it makes sense to have to try to replace Zelensky with someone else. And given the fact that he's there now, his term has expired, it could open up for it. And then indeed in Ukraine as well, he is not very popular at all. So if there would be an election, he would be gone. Now, I'm not sure. I think also Zelensky's efforts to promise these minerals to Trump, it's a way of trying to elevate his own legitimacy. Keep in mind that Trump called him a dictator, which is, again, a way of saying that he's not legitimate. So Zelensky's been insisting that if they sign a deal with the US to hand over the minerals, Zelensky should be there to sign it with Trump. And this is a way of asserting his legitimacy in the United States. So I think the legitimacy issue is a is a key problem. But it's also a good way to get around with Europeans, because if the Europeans try to create a hassle and not accept a peace agreement, then it would be much harder for the Europeans to oppose this if there is a president in Ukraine who also wants to accept the peace. Because at the moment, everyone seems to be on the same side. That is the United States, Russia, China, the majority of Ukrainians, all of them now wants a peace deal. It's just the Europeans standing on the sideline trying to sabotage it effectively. So if they can shift to Zelensky, they can also make the Europeans fall in line. So if I was Zelensky, I would start packing some suitcases at least in case there's time to leave very soon.
Yeah, I think that that certainly is probably the case. Well, a lot to watch and a lot to follow with this, and we will continue to do it. And we are very happy to have you with us to help us sort through it all. Glenn Diesen, professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you.
Rania?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so crazy to watch. I can't get over Marco Rubio, being at the forefront as Secretary of State. I mean, he's just been such an insane hawk on everything. I guess he knows he has to be a yes man right now. And obviously, I think we're seeing Marco Rubio's more invested in a war on China. But it's just been weird to see him be like the one talking about ending the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and having to, laughing it up with the Russian officials there in Saudi Arabia. But, Marco Rubio is one of many of these people who, once sort of beaten by Trump in the electoral arena, then, became a sort of sycophantic supporter. And I think that's one of the things that's most interesting to see how desperate these people are to be close to some form of power and to feel like their voice matters, that even people maybe forget this now. I mean, Rubio was abjectly humiliated by Trump in the 2016 race. I mean, truly
Marco
humiliated.
Rubio.
And
Little
here
Marco
he was.
Rubio.
Here he was this time campaigning for him. The only thing I can remember is when he was going out against plastic straws, trying to sound like Trump, going out and talking about how they want plastic straws. We don't want plastic or paper straws. We want paper straws here in Florida. Sounded ridiculous, looks ridiculous, is ridiculous, but, dangerous in a sense. Well, speaking of Marco Rubio, some in Latin America, call him Narco Rubio because of his longtime ties with the far right all across Latin America, whose base of operations is Miami, and of course, whose income is often heavily intertwined with those of various drug traffickers. I mean, the right wing of Latin America, not Marco Rubio. Don't want a lawsuit here. But that being said, also really made his name as a major, major critic of Cuba and attempting to really destroy the country with his various congressional actions. Now he's Secretary of State, continuing in the same line. So to talk more about some of what's happening there, 90 miles away from Florida, we are very honored to have with us Claudia de la Cruz. Some of you know her as a former presidential candidate, but you also should get to know her as the new and very exciting for me to see executive director of the iconic Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, IFCO, Pastors for Peace. Claudia, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be with you both. So I'm hoping you're both well in the midst of chaos.
Listen, I just, as my good friend Jared Ball says, as well as can be expected. Well, let me just ask you this, because there's obviously a lot happening in terms of them finding ways to tighten the blockade against Cuba, to choke Cuba off. But I want to actually start a little bit with framing for people who maybe don't fully understand the impact of the sum total of these policies, Claudia. I mean, what is this blockade? Like, what is the impact of all of these various actions, including some we'll talk about here, on the actual island and the people of Cuba?
I mean, it impacts every level of life, Eugene, every level of life for the Cuban people. I think something that is very important to say and for the people in the United States to understand is that when they talk about sanctions and blockade, they're not talking about things that affect the government per se. It affects the people. It affects the ability for people to get medical supplies. It affects the people's ability to get food. It affects the students from getting the most basic educational materials, technology. And so one of the things that we've been seeing, I just came back from Cuba not long ago, and we're talking about electricity shortages of 15 to 20 hours in the whole entire country because of the electricity grid being so old and not having the possibilities of engaging in business with other countries that could be sanctioned as if they were to do businesses with Cuba. And so it is a way of strangling the economy. It is a way of creating a death sentence for the population, creating a crisis that is so deep that it then creates a level of internal turmoil where people are demanding things rightfully, but that the government cannot necessarily provide for. For example, Cuba has free healthcare. It has free education. People have access to housing at a cost that is less than 10% of their income, if not free, because it's been generational housing. And so they have that, but the infrastructure has been suffocated so much for over the course of 60 years that it's hard for the government to be able to provide what people need. So you have all these basic rights that are there free and accessible for people, but you don't have access to hypertension medicine, for example. And then you have to create a way or a plan in which certain things are prioritized. There's a shortage of baby food, milk for babies. And this is what the blockade is doing for the people in Cuba. And in addition to the blockade, there's the list of states that sponsor terrorism. Now, Cuba has a historic mission of solidarity and collaboration that is part of their foreign policy. Terrorism is not part of the nature and character of the Cuban society. In fact, they have created space for negotiations of peace with Colombia and many other countries. And so there is no evidence that there has been any terrorist plotting or that they're harboring any terrorists in Cuba at all. And without evidence, the United States has placed Cuba in that list of states that sponsor terrorism, which has been politicized and utilized to strangle economies, to topple leaderships and governments in the past. And so we need to be very conscious and be very critical that these people that talk about democracy and talk about care for humanity are the ones that are promoting and imposing terrorist acts on countries all over the world. And we should only think about the United States. I mean, Narco Rubio is now talking about, his concern for this medical missions and the doctors and how they're being exploited. But he has said nothing about the ways in which the people that are in our healthcare system in this country are now organizing, because they don't have equipment and they don't have access to the most basic things, how they did in COVID as well. People are organizing to be able to get better conditions, better pay in this country. He has nothing to say about the workers here that are exploited. But he has a lot to say about Cuba, a place that he's never set foot in. He's got Cuban legacy, but even the Cubans say it. He's never been to Cuba. And so he has no idea, because ultimately as part of this attack on the Cuban economy is an attack on the Cuban revolution, is an attack on the Cuban people by someone who claims to be Cuban, but is nothing short of a U.S. imperialist.
It's so ironic, Claudia, that you have the U.S. accusing Cuba of being a state sponsor of terrorism when it's the U.S. that exports war and weapons and terrorism, while Cuba exports, one of the things it's most famous for exporting is medical care to areas, really, really, really poor areas of the world, to remote areas and poor countries that otherwise wouldn't have it. And here is my way of segueing into the fact that Cuba's medical brigades have now, under this administration, been sanctioned, not just the medical brigades, those who participate, but the families of people who participate in the medical brigades. So can you talk to us a bit about these medical brigades and what they do? And I just want to point out, I remember during the first Trump administration, when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State, there was the coup in Bolivia, and there was a U.S.-installed fascist dictator that was put in place. And one of the first things that the new fascistic female president of Bolivia did at the time was she expelled the Cuban doctors who were providing medical care, free medical care, to some of the poorest people in Bolivia. And Mike Pompeo was applauding this. So anyways, can you talk about the importance of the Cuban medical brigades around the world and why it is that the U.S. has been trying so hard and is now actually attacking this program?
I think it's important to say that all around the world, specifically in the global South, the medical missions of Cuba are well known and are considered to be a sign of solidarity and a sign of hope. The Cuba medical missions are a cornerstone of its foreign policy, and it's rooted in solidarity, not profit. Profit has always been at the forefront and at the center of everything that the United States does, but it's not for Cuba. Since the 1960s, Cuba has sent over 400,000 healthcare professionals to more than 160 countries. That is huge. That is a huge contribution. Cuban doctors were on the front lines during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. They were there when the earthquake happened in Haiti. They were there, to support and provide help and medical assistance to people during the COVID-19 pandemic, often arriving before any of the other wealthier nations. So Cuba has exported a very necessary resource to the world. Cuban doctors volunteer for these missions and are very much celebrated as heroes in their communities. The doctors assume it with a lot of honor and a lot of pride. This is something that I think is important to say. They volunteer to do this. Often the word exploitation is connected to this Cuban missions. And the reality is that we need to, as people living in the United States, gain a real understanding of how exploitation works. Because exploitation in the United States, it's equal to having the biggest theft in this country being wage theft. Exploitation means that you could work to your bone and not have your most basic necessary things met, like housing, like health, like food. I think it's very important to make that distinction. The medical missions from Cuba are a structured program that benefit both the doctors and the communities they serve. And these missions provide Cuban doctors with invaluable experiences as well. They provide services in communities that have probably never seen doctors in their lives, in the most horrible conditions that capitalism creates for many countries, that neoliberalism creates for many countries. And they do so in ways that are come from, again, international solidarity and the sense of humanitarianism. The idea that they are forced to do this could only come from a capitalist system that does not understand solidarity and does not understand internationalism. So Cuba has a historical legacy of international solidarity. In fact, collaborating is a significant part of their foreign policy. And while Cuba sends doctors all across the world to save lives, the United States exports war, genocide, violence. I mean, Martin Luther King said it. The United States is the biggest purveyor of violence. And so what moral authority does the United States have to sanction Cuba for exporting life-saving resources like their doctors?
I think this is an important issue, and there's not a ton of polling on this issue on a regular basis, but, when Obama was loosening, or maybe not loosening, but let's just say trying to improve ties a little bit with Cuba, there was some polling. Chicago Council on Global Affairs, 67% of all people in the United States thought that the blockade should be ended. That, by the way, includes 59% of Republicans, and the vast majority of them, when they were asked similar questions, said they didn't think that, opening up relations would end the Cuban government. So obviously people not, in favor of regime change, really. They just think there should be open relations between the two countries and that Cuba has a right to have their own social system. So I say that just to say, who are the people who are supporting this? I mean, you would think if you're a politician and 67% of people, including 59% of Republicans, were like, let's do that, you would be like, yeah, let's do that. So talk a little bit, if you can, about who it is who's behind this, because it feels very anti-democratic.
I mean, it is very anti-democratic. The very essence of the system in which we live in the United States is anti-democratic. And so it doesn't necessarily matter that the polls say that there's a majority of people in this country that are against the blockade and feel that there should be the normalization of relationships with Cuba. Just like it doesn't matter, in many ways, whether the people want another type of political system in this country. Like it's not democratic at all. Inherently, capitalism responds to a democracy that only favors the ruling class. And so when you ask, who are the people that are pushing forth all these different sanctions and attacks against Cuba, are the people that want to see Cuba in its knees, is the people that want to be able to make Cuba another colony or neo-colony of the United States, is the corporations, is the banks, are the same billionaires that want to, conduct a coup in places like Bolivia to be able to have access to lithium, or want to conduct a coup in Venezuela to have access to the oil. And so these are the folks that are interested in maintaining this attacks against Cuba, the people who don't really care about the Cuban people at all, the people who don't care about the people in the United States, the working class people in the United States at all either, the same ones that are strangling us with all the different policies that they're pushing forth, the ones that have waged a war against the working class in this country are the same ones that are waging war against the Cuban people. And it's important to say Cuba, in terms of their, they have the medical mission, but IFCO, Passes for Peace, has been working very closely with the Latin American School of Medicine, for example. Cuba trains thousands of international students, including, again, from low-income communities in the United States within the Latin American Latin American School of Medicine. We have over 200 graduates from the United States that have been trained in Cuba, and they have been trained in Cuba for free. And these are students that become doctors that don't have to worry about having hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And not only are they trained there for free, they're also formed ideologically to serve their community, not to make healthcare a profitable industry. And so I think it's important to bring that to the forefront, because these are the type of collaborations that the empire, that the U.S. imperialists and capitalists are unwilling to allow to develop. They don't want to develop relationships in that way because they won't make profit. And all they are centering their policies around is making profit and strangling Cuba as a possible example of what is possible if we build a different society.
Claudia, as real quick before we wrap here, I just wanted to ask you, as people are probably wondering, what can I do? What should people be doing when it comes to this issue? I mean, the U.S. is directly involved in strangling this island nation not so far away from Florida. So I think it's the responsibility of Americans who know to do something about it. What can they do?
I think it's important for folks to get involved in demanding that Cuba is taken off the list and the designation of a state that sponsors terrorism, precisely because this designation exacerbates the U.S. blockade's impact on Cuba. I mean, conditions are, becoming worse and worse by the day. And Cuba has no possibility of international financial systems, accessing them to trade, to investment, which are things that all countries basically need for their lifeline. So folks should look into organizations like IFCO, the NNOC, the National Network in Solidarity with Cuba, and other organizations that are doing solidarity work. The Hadwe Project is also a project that does a lot of humanitarian aid and work with Cuba. And look for ways to organize around getting Cuba off the list, the continuous demands in whatever work we do to end the blockade on Cuba. If people have the possibility of traveling to Cuba, is also a good thing. Connecting with the Cuban people, connecting with the different agencies and organizations that are doing work to maintain the Cuban revolution. There's a lot of things people could do. If folks would want to get more information, they could always visit ifconews.org and get more information on the medical program, get more information on the delegations that we're building and the education program. But joining the movement in solidarity with Cuba is a responsibility that we have as people living in the United States, knowing that the U.S. government that we pay taxes to has been responsible for asphyxiating the life of Cuba. And in spite of that level of attack, Cuba has been a resource and a beacon of hope internationally. There is nowhere you go anywhere in the world that you speak about the Cuban missions or the Cuban doctors or the education system in Cuba that there isn't a high level of respect and a high level of love for the work that Cuba has done for the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a lot here, a lot to keep covering. We'll keep covering it. We appreciate you being willing to come on and help us sort through it all. Claudia de la Cruz, Executive Director of IFCO Pastors for Peace. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
I mean, Eugene, it's just insane what the U.S. is doing to Cuba, what the U.S. has been doing to Cuba, and now, I mean, things are just so bad. When you hear like 15 hours without electricity across the nation, and this is a country that tries to do its best to provide for everyone in it, and that's why it's being strangled, because it has a system that wants to provide for everyone, unlike the one that we have in the U.S., where, you know, it's basically like dog eat dog, survival of the fittest kind of attitude.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things people often point out here in the U.S. is the huge amount of money that goes to the military-industrial complex and not to helping the people of the country. So since we're on the subject, I want to turn to our next story, which is war games with the U.S. and South Korea that are getting ready to take place relatively soon. I mean, somewhat amazing given everything happening in South Korea. They're still prioritizing this one. But the U.S. command, you know, by the way, their motto, the U.S. command in Korea is fight tonight. So it's all about war. It's all about fighting. So they're continuing their preparation. So to get into all of this and the implications of it, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Joo-hyun Park, who is a member of Notatol and also the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-hyun, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Eugene, Rania, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Well, great to have you on it. And maybe I guess I'll just pose the question to you of what does it say about the sort of political leadership in South Korea that despite the fact that they're still dealing with many issues flowing from the impeachment against the coup attempt by the now impeached president, that they're putting high priority on massive war games with the United States?
I mean, what a question, Eugene. Let's break out the gate with the important facts. So as you mentioned, yes, South Korea is in the grips of a deep political crisis as we speak. And this has been ongoing for nearly 3 months following the failed martial law coup attempt by President Yoon back in December. President Yoon is currently facing his final impeachment hearings in the Constitutional Court. And all this time, we have had people out in the millions, out in the hundreds of thousands on any given day as part of an ongoing protest movement in South Korea, pushing forward a broad platform of progressive demands. These include everything from agricultural reform to better protection for workers to more access for disabled transit users in the city of Seoul. Basically anything under the sun that you can think of that would help advance society, people are out on the streets in South Korea demanding. What they're not demanding is more military spending. What they're not demanding are more war games. And yet that is what this caretaker government, which by the way, is unelected because it is an acting government, is prioritizing at this time. They're undertaking these massive Freedom Shield war games on behalf of the US. And I think it really tells us a lot about how political priorities get set in South Korea, because you have all these masses of people who are demanding a better future right now. And yet the political class, those in power, can only really be bothered to serve the agenda of the big conglomerates and, of course, the United States, which backs up the capitalist system in South Korea with their massive military presence.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the fact that, you know, the U.S. and South Korea, they frame these war drills as defensive, but you have always argued that they're highly, highly provocative. So can you explain to our audience how these exercises actually end up escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula and why they're seen as a direct threat by North Korea?
Absolutely. I think that the idea that the war exercises that the US conducts in Korea are defensive in nature is a complete canard. It's a total myth that we need to take apart piece by piece. And really what needs to be impressed on everyone is that there's nothing defensive about these exercises. They're aggressive. If anything, we could say they're offensive exercises, both in the sense that they are practicing for military maneuvers where the US would be the instigator, and they are deeply offensive to the sovereignty of the Korean people. So to get a little bit more into these war exercises and exactly what they are, what do we mean when we say war games in the first place? What we're talking about is the use of large numbers of troops, of very dangerous weapon systems in Korea that essentially practice how they would go about a real war. And so these war games can include exercises like how would we, say, stage an occupation of North Korea? Or how would we invade North Korea? Last summer, we saw something that was completely unprecedented, where the South Korean and the US governments, for the first time, had a joint drill where they talked about what they would do if it came down to using a nuclear weapon on the Korean peninsula. So I think something we need to understand is that these aren't just these sorts of innocent exercises that the US is performing, but these are actually essentially rehearsals for war crimes, crimes that the United States has committed around the world, continues to commit to this day, and has a history of committing in Korea as well. So that's the way that's what colors everything about how progressive Korean people, whether they're in North Korea or in South Korea, view these war games. We understand them from the lens of our history. We understand them through the lens of what the US is known to do around the world. And we see nothing but many reasons to be deeply concerned. Now, when it comes to how it affects the relations with North Korea in particular, what we need to understand is that the war games are at this point one of the primary reasons for the state of relations with North Korea between South Korea and the United States, which is incredibly poor. The US has drastically escalated its war exercises in the last couple of years. In 2023, there were more than 200 days out of the entire year where the US was conducting war games in Korea. Last year in 2024, that number reached 275 days of the year. So for 275 days of the year, the US is conducting these games. And I think something that we need to be understanding here is that every single time we have a large war exercise like Freedom Shield, North Korea has to go on high alert, because what's happening is that tens of thousands of troops are swarming into the peninsula. They're bringing strategic weapons like aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, heavy bombers. I could go on. But all the weaponry that the United States would need to launch an actual war against the DPRK. And while they say it's a drill every time, it's not responsible from the standpoint of national defense to treat that claim at face value. North Korea has to put all its military on high alert during these times. So these are incredibly tense times in the peninsula, where even a small accident can potentially trigger a much, much larger conflict. And I think another thing we need to note about Freedom Shield and other exercises like it is that it's not just that they are growing in quantity, but they are also growing in the kinds of aggressive exercises and the nature of their aggression as well. Last year, something we saw that was totally unprecedented was that 11 countries, in addition to South Korea and the US, sent their own troops to Korea to participate in Freedom Shield. And something we're anticipating now is whether or not that could be repeated during a very critical time when, as I mentioned before, South Korea lacks an elected government and relations with North Korea are at a historic low. But what we're seeing is that there is a clear trend of escalation, and there's actually very little reason to believe that the US will back down from that when it begins Freedom Shield in a couple of weeks in March.
No, I think that that's a really important point. And I mean, it also seems that, when you look at the political crisis, you look at these war games, I mean, there's so many threads connecting them. I mean, one being just in terms of the possibility of war, as we've talked about in the past in the show, and you could talk about this, it seems that maybe provoking a war was one of the things that Yoon was thinking about to help back his coup. But also when you see this deep interoperability between the two militaries, many people wondering, is it credible to think the U.S. knew nothing about what was taking place with the coup? Could they have played a role? Could they have greenlighted it? I mean, obviously, we don't have all the information to know that. But it does seem that the two issues aren't really separate issues in terms of the broader sort of political security scene.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, Eugene, because this is a topic that's completely escaped the narrative when it comes to the US media coverage of South Korea's political crisis. There have been pretty much daily hearings in the National Assembly, that's the parliament of South Korea, since the coup attempt on December 3rd. And there has been a lot uncovered, not only about the plans and the conspiracy, the extent of it, who was involved, the precise details that we're going to execute with the coup plan had it gone forward and become more successful. But in addition to that, there's been a lot uncovered about what was going on in the final days of the Yoon administration. Back in October, there was a very peculiar incident where North Korea announced to the world that South Korean military drones had been spotted flying over their capital of Pyongyang and dropping propaganda leaflets. And they were actually able to procure a number of these drones and produce photographs that showed that these drones were identical models to drones that were known to be used by the South Korean military. Now, what's been uncovered in the process of the National Assembly hearings is that we now know that Yoon's former Minister of Defense gave the order for those drones to be sent to Pyongyang, violating the airspace of North Korea, intentionally committing an act of war, really. And what we have learned as well is that this was tied to general plans to attempt to instigate some kind of what was referred to as a limited war with North Korea by the coup planners. And I think that we need to think very deeply about how this kind of reactionary clique within the ruling class in South Korea, represented by the likes of Yoon Suk-yeol, by his party, the People's Power Party, has been empowered through their relationship by the United States. Yoon and the People's Power Party are the preferred puppets of the US when it comes to South Korea. They understand that relationship very well, and they use it to their advantage. President Yoon was reviled throughout his entire tenure in office, and yet he was constantly being praised internationally by Washington. He was referred to as a democratic leader. And what we are learning is that this so-called democratic leader always had aspirations for establishing or really reestablishing a dictatorship in South Korea, and that he was willing to trigger a war that could have pulled in the United States if it came down to it. There have been additional details uncovered from the night of the coup itself concerning the use of fake North Korean military uniforms by South Korean soldiers in order to stage a number of different kinds of assassinations and attacks on South Korean politicians, against civilians, even potentially against the United States military. And this rabbit hole just goes so deep. And, it's really only South Korea's government which is continuing this investigative process, but the details of this are really not being discussed in the wider world, when really we were looking at a scenario on the night of President Yoon's coup attempt that could have easily spiraled into World War III. And so I think that when we look at these war games today, when we look at the US-ROK alliance, we have to understand that it is a fundamentally dangerous relationship, not only for Korea, not only because there are constantly about 30,000 troops and 62 US military bases in Korea at any given time, but also because this relationship gives the most backward, the most violent, the most conservative sector of the ruling class in Korea the confidence to believe that they have the backing of the world's superpower in order to basically prosecute any kind of agenda they see fit, whether that is domestically or internationally, in attempting to start a war with North Korea that could trigger a regional conflict.
Julian, I think given all that you've said, with tensions just being at their highest, the potential for it to spiral out of control in an even more dangerous way at any moment, what role do movements for peace and even reunification, both, of course, in Korea and internationally, what role do those movements have in pushing back against this U.S. militarization and advocating for a different future for Korea?
Right. I think one of the most important things is that we have to play our part in breaking the US's monopoly on the narrative over Korea. Right now, we have a situation where the US is able to act with impunity in Korea because it is in a position to be able to define the truth for the world, even though, of course, we know that the narratives that it's propagating are, in fact, deeply biased towards its own interests, which are not in support of peace and prosperity for the Korean people. And I think when it comes to exactly what we need to do around Freedom Shield, I want to point to what organizations in South Korea are going to be doing in a couple of days and what we're joining them to do here in the US as Norutor. On March 1st, there are going to be a number of mobilizations across South Korea, across the US as well, opposing Freedom Shield, supporting the demands of people in South Korea who are pushing for a progressive transformation of their society. And this is all being done on March 1st, which is an incredibly significant date in the history of the Korean independence struggle. If I had a little bit more time, I'd share more details about that. But I really encourage folks to come out to a mobilization, particularly if you're in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Those are places where Noruto will be mobilizing. There's also going to be another mobilization occurring in Seattle. So find out the information, join us, and learn more about what's really going on in Korea, the US's role in it, and how we can continue this movement and this struggle, because it's really not right that the US is able to essentially do whatever it wants on the Korean Peninsula. It's an incredible danger to the Korean people. It really puts the people of the world at risk as well, given all the geopolitical interests that are tied up in our homeland. And so we all have to play a role together in order to start building the momentum to create a force that is capable of stopping it and imposing some kinds of restrictions and limits on what the US ruling class thinks it can get away with.
Well, a lot to cover, a lot to continue to cover. We are always very honored to have you with us, Joo-hyun Park, who's a member of Noruto and also the engagement editor at The Real News. Thanks, as always, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. Have a great one.
Rania, I'd like to make a suggestion if you're open to it. I feel like you should have Joo-hyun on Rania Khalek's dispatches to get into the whole history of Korea and the things that he was mentioning there. Not only basically a genocidal war waged by the United States against Korea.
Yeah. I actually have had Julian on several times to talk about Korea, but I'd like to do another episode soon. But if anybody's interested, we've done some really excellent historical deep dives. Go check out Rania Khalek dispatches, look up Julian. Not now, because right now you're watching this, but when you're done, go look up those episodes, because it's full of really important, useful information that you don't hear in U.S. media because it's all funded by weapons companies.
Yes, indeed. Although if there was a video you were gonna bail on the live stream for, that one I could probably live with.
Are you suggesting people stop watching the live stream and go watch my show, Rania Khalek Dispatches?
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying if they chose to watch the episodes with you and Joo-hyun about Korea, I would ultimately, I can only be but so mad. It's important. It's critically important. But please wait. That's all I'm saying. But, sometimes you can't wait. Well, let's turn the page here and move to another crucial issue that continues to be ongoing. That is the ongoing struggle of the Palestinian people. Obviously, the ceasefire back and forth as it concerns Gaza, but of course, the continued escalation happening in the West Bank. And we are honored to be joined here on the show once again by Layan Sima Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum, also an editor at 1804 Books, 1804books.com. Layan, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be back with you both.
Well, it's great to have you here with us. Maybe just give us a sense of what the state is with the ceasefire. I know there's been some back and forth between whether or not people were going to be released, and then they were being released, and then it was under certain circumstances, and then Israel saying they're backing out of some parts and staying on the border with Egypt, and all these. It just seems like it's hard to follow on a day-to-day basis exactly what's happening for many people. So what's happening with the ceasefire? Is it holding? Is it ongoing? Are the Israelis doing what they said they're going to do? What's happening?
Well, Eugene, it's holding by one definition, because if you ignore the constant Israeli violations of the ceasefire, then we might say it's still continuing to hold. But in the formal sense, yes, it's still holding. The negotiations for the second phase have begun today. The Israelis finally sent a delegation to Cairo to meet with their counterparts from Qatar and the United States. And they're now talking about the next phase. Now, Israel has been very much trying to sabotage the ceasefire agreement or stall moving to the second phase. They've requested to extend the first phase for a longer period of time. The defense minister, Katz, has been declaring that they will not withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, which is the southern border between Gaza and Egypt, which they are supposed to have fully withdrawn from this area by the end of the first phase. So Katz is going on to the media saying they will not, that they are going to consider this a buffer zone. They've asked for an extension of the first phase, basically to stay there longer. last week they did not, even though they received, they did not release the hostages, the Palestinian hostages, known to the media as Palestinian prisoners, on the deadline that had been agreed upon. They held them for longer. Finally, yesterday, they released them. And the reason why they said they wouldn't release these 600 Palestinian hostages from Israeli prisons, they're being held there illegally under international law, is because they did not want to see any more of the handover ceremonies that Hamas had been carrying out as they released the Israelis who they were holding captive in the Gaza Strip. They found these ceremonies to be offensive to the Israeli project. And we saw images from those ceremonies, the Israelis who were being held in Gaza, looking well fed, looking happy. These are the scenes that the Israeli government wanted to avoid seeing on the world stage. So the 4 remains of Israelis were handed over to the Red Cross by Hamas yesterday, and in exchange, the Israelis finally released another batch of Palestinians, 600. A good number of those have been deported abroad. A larger number have been returned to Gaza, and then some to the West Bank. So we're in a fragile state. It's clear that the Israelis are nervous about moving to the second phase. There's not unity within the Israeli government around what they want to do. There's a significant portion of the Israeli government that wants to go back to active fighting in Gaza. So we have to see what's going to happen in the next few days.
You know, Layan, when it comes to these ceasefires, which Israel continues to violate, I mean, they're so one-sided, whether we're talking about the ceasefire in Gaza, whether we're talking about, the ceasefire in Lebanon, the Israelis continue to bomb, they continue to violate, they continue to attack. I mean, they just bombed Rafah a couple of days ago. They keep denying things from going into Gaza. Like you said, they had refused to release these Palestinian hostages, just trying to find any reason to undermine these ceasefires. And others have argued that these ceasefires serve as these strategic pauses for the Israelis to basically regroup and then continue their attacks. So I'm just curious, what strategies do you think Israel is using to sabotage this deal? And how do these attempts at sabotage fit into its longer term objectives in Gaza and beyond? And maybe now would be just a good time to mention that we all just saw that disgusting video that Trump put up that was created by AI. I'm not sure who made it, but it was disgusting. It just was just blatant colonialism. All he sees is beachfront property in Gaza, which speaks to those longer term ambitions of people, of the Israelis and those aligned with them like Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I would first start by saying that I think that the ceasefire, on the one hand, you could see it as a moment for the Israelis to be regrouping, but let's also remember the terms under which the ceasefire came into effect, which actually was the terms that Hamas had proposed months and months before. And Israel was forced to come to the table to accept those terms. Now, as the ceasefire is continuing, they are, of course, looking for ways to undermine those terms, which they never really wanted. They wanted to see the full disarmament and dissolution of Hamas, for example. Now, that's not what we're seeing on the streets of Gaza. That we're not seeing that Hamas has laid down weapons or that Hamas has gone away. And in fact, Hamas has said, we agree to all the terms of the ceasefire. We are committed to the ceasefire, has continuously said this, but has said that no, we will not disarm. And to ask people who have been the recipients of genocidal bombing for over 15 months to disarm is a huge thing. So this is one of the things that Israel is trying to find a way to make possible through the ceasefire moment right now. This is also something that they have in common with the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been very clear. They've said word for word that Hamas is a red line, that they would like to see Hamas completely, they insist on seeing Hamas completely demilitarized. Trump has a vision for Gaza that he put out in a very offensive video of capitalist development, of just turning it into a resort, basically, completely completely ignoring the social fabric of the Palestinian people and their right to a sovereign society in the Gaza territory. And he has said that he is going to do everything he can to make that possible. So the Trump administration and the Israelis are united on their vision for the day after. Now, it is unclear exactly now how the Trump administration is relating to the Israelis' wishes right now. It seems that the Trump administration would like the ceasefire to go forward, whether or not it is for them to have more time to try to build out this plan of turning Gaza into some sort of tourist resort area that would line the Trump administration with more money. I'm not sure, and we're not sure. We can't tell for sure. But we know that they are now at the table. The Israelis are at the table with the Americans. They are negotiating the second phase of the ceasefire. We don't know if they will result in the next few days with an agreement, if there will be an extension, or if there will be a return to the fighting. This we'll know more in every hour that passes. Of course, Hamas has said that they want to go to the second phase of the ceasefire, that they will abide by the terms, and that they are ready for doing so. So it's really the Israelis and the Americans that are stalling, that are sabotaging, and that are undermining the process.
Layan, one other important aspect here is the West Bank. Obviously, the Israelis are sending tanks into Jenin for the first time in 20 years, and people should look up why it's taken that long. Didn't go that well for them the last time, but nonetheless, they are returning, continuing to escalate. We've seen Representative Brian Mast from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who once volunteered with the IDF and actually once wore an Israeli military uniform in Congress as a congressman, as part of a little performance he was doing there. Just going to leave that to the side, but people should think about that too. Now calling on all the committee staff at the House Foreign Affairs Committee to refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which of course is only the language used by the most sort of expansionist, settler colonial elements of the Israeli political establishment. I guess I just wonder if you think that to some degree, given the inability to impose a solution on Gaza, now there is an attempt to turn towards imposing, even greater land grabs and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as something of a gift to the far right forces who are angry that they were not able to complete their genocide in Gaza.
I think that's a definite possibility. When the ceasefire was first coming into effect, there was some signs saying that one of the ways in which Netanyahu was able to get his government to agree to the Gaza ceasefire was by basically saying that Trump will give us the West Bank as a gift. There's elements of the Trump administration who have declared that Judea and Samaria is the correct name for the West Bank, that annexing the West Bank is definitely on the table for Israel. It's something that the United States would support. And it's not coincidental that around the same time that the ceasefire came into effect in Gaza, that there was this escalated assault on the West Bank. We've seen now displacement of over 40,000 people from the West Bank. Many of those people are previously people who have been displaced before. They are being displaced from refugee camps in which generations have been living, waiting for the chance to be able to return to their ancestral homes. There's been assaults on hospitals. There have been assaults on homes. Basically, all the techniques that we've seen in Gaza are being played out now in the West Bank. The tanks entering in is another escalation of the Israeli assault on the West Bank. And I don't think it's coincidental at all. There are elements of the Israeli government and society that is unwilling to accept an actual pause of the war against the Palestinian people. And so in order to make the ceasefire in Gaza happen, Israelis are also continuing their assault in other places. It's not just Palestine as well. What happened over the past few days? Israel has been bombing Syria, bombing large areas of southern Syria all the way to Damascus. They have occupied a significant amount of Syrian territory. Now, even the Syrian government under Ahmed al-Shara has actually said that this is a violation of Syria's sovereignty. They had not said this so clearly for quite some time. But Israel has said that they will remain there. And just today, they have said that they will remain in Lebanon, holding a buffer zone by the southern border. Katz declared this as well, and he said that he has American approval for this, also a violation of the terms of the ceasefire in Lebanon. So the Israeli assault on the Palestinian and neighboring Arab people is continuing. Still, drones are assassinating Lebanese, and bombs are still falling on Syria. So we need to look at this in the full picture, not just what's happening in Gaza, where there's still continued violations of the ceasefire, assassinations, and killings being carried out there as well. But we need to look at all of the areas in which Israel is fighting against the Palestinian Arab people in the region.
Well, Layan, as always, we really appreciate you coming through to help us sort through it all, explain a lot of complicated news to us. I'm sure we'll be calling on you again. Layan Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum in New York City and an editor of 1804 Books. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Rania, Lebanon was mentioned. That's where you are. A lot of things happening there as well. I mean, of course, the huge funeral, 1.5 million people there for Hassan Nasrallah. I think there's, very few funerals in history. It's got to be, 3 or 4 I can think off the top of my head that have been this size. So a massive show of force. The president there, I know trying to create sort of a mood of national unity. There is the confidence vote. And I see that there's, anyway, long story short, I wonder how you're feeling. Obviously, there's a lot of context. Israel's continuing to occupy, but it does seem, maybe this is just me, Rania. Maybe I'm just optimistic and, too starry-eyed, but that there is sort of maybe a renewed sense of national unity in the country in terms of the need to move forward in a new way. I don't know. Are you feeling hopeful? What's the situation there on the ground?
So I don't know if national unity is the right word because Lebanon remains a very polarized country, and the political situation in the country right now is one in which you have a government in place that is incapable or refusing to stand up for Lebanon's sovereignty. Israel continues to violate the ceasefire. Lebanon does nothing and says nothing oftentimes about it. Israel continues to bomb Lebanon when it pleases. The government is, incapable or unwilling to say or really do anything about that. And it's making a huge segment of the country feel like they're on their own. And it's actually, continuing to give a justification for Hezbollah's existence in the first place. The reason Hezbollah exists is because it's the way that people in South Lebanon organize to protect their community against Israeli occupation and land theft and ongoing attempts to reoccupy Lebanon, invade Lebanon, and bomb Lebanon. And if you have a Lebanese government that is incapable or unwilling to address that very real ongoing threat that continues as we speak, then you're going to continue to have people organize separately from that government to protect themselves. And that's exactly what Hezbollah is. The funeral over the weekend on Sunday, on February 23rd, was very well organized. It was very highly attended, as you can see in the images on the screen. Over 1 million people. Of course, the American and Western press attempted to downplay those numbers. I mean, I even saw ridiculous attempts to say tens of thousands, which was just absurd. The streets were so full of people. There was also attempts domestically to say that they were all flown in, because people did come from all around the world, but it was like something like 140,000 people came to Lebanon during the funeral. Many of those people went to the funeral. That is a lot. People came from all over to come pay their respects. And people inside the country, Lebanon's a very small country. I don't even think it's 6 million people. So to have over 1 million people come to this funeral was a huge show of the support that continues to exist for Hezbollah and for resistance. And that's why this funeral was upsetting for the Israelis and the Americans to see, because it demonstrated that, yes, they did kill Hassan Nasrallah. They killed Hashem Safieddin, the man who was briefly was supposed to be Secretary General after Hassan Nasrallah's death, and they killed him in a massive bombing with tens of thousands of bunker buster bomb explosives provided by the U.S. that took out an entire apartment block. They killed him as well. And so this funeral was meant to show that we still have a base of support here. Like the Hezbollah is the people. And these are people who are willing to continue to sacrifice to protect their land and to defend their territory. And the Israelis, there is a ceasefire in place in Lebanon. The Israelis extended that ceasefire rather than withdraw repeatedly. And they still have remained on several points, high points on the border on Lebanese territory. So they're occupying areas of Lebanon to try to maintain their military supremacy, and it's still destroying homes to make sure that they can create this buffer zone, because at the end of the day, the Israelis recognize that the mere existence of people at the border between Israel and Lebanon is the threat, because people living at the border are people who will defend their land at all costs, and that is what Israel sees as a threat. So in their minds, it's we need to remove the people to remove the threat, which is why they've tried to destroy all of these villages on the border. But people still went back. People still plan to rebuild their homes, and people are still very much willing to sacrifice and fight and die if they have to for their land. So the Israelis really have another thing coming if they think that because they killed Hassan Nasrallah, they defeated Hezbollah. That is not to say that this was definitely a weakening of Hezbollah. It's no longer a regional power, though that has more to do with the fact that, Syria is no longer a part of the resistance axis, if that even still exists in the Middle East. Lebanon's quite surrounded at this point. But, Hezbollah's weakened, but it still exists. How it regroups, how it cleans house, how it evolves after this remains to be seen. But what's clear is that no matter what happens moving forward, people will continue to organize to defend their land, whether they organize under the banner of Hezbollah, whether something else comes up. We have to wait and see. No one can, really predict what's going to happen in the future. But, I also want to say that the Israelis did scare everybody. And they made this big show of force with fighter jets flying very low during the funeral, and everybody could hear it. And people responded by chanting "Death to Israel." So, that makes you just see how, in the face of Israeli threats, people are quite defiant. So that's what happened over the weekend. And moving forward, I think you're going to see Hezbollah step back, and they've kind of stepped back to say, look, if everybody wants to say that the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army is the sole defender of Lebanon, then let's see them do it. And they've taken a step back so they can kind of deal with their own internal issues, deal with domestic politics. We'll see how that goes. And what's being demonstrated so far is that if you do leave it to the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army, they just don't have the capability, or again, are unwilling to do anything. And they're also under the influence of the Americans and under threat of the Americans, as well as, other American allies like the Saudis and other players in the region. Lebanon, I think we've had Anis Germani on this show before come on and talk about this. And he makes a really good point that Lebanon is a playground for various foreign powers. And everybody is kind of at the whim of this or that foreign power. That first and foremost means the United States of America. So when we talk about Lebanese sovereignty, they talk about Iran this, Iran that. It's actually the Americans that are constantly trying to dictate what happens in Lebanon, all to protect the Israelis. So anyways, all that's to say, the funeral demonstrated the massive support that remains for resistance in this country. Israel did not defeat that. And moving forward, the Israelis continue to violate the ceasefire, and we'll see what happens as a result of that.
We will indeed. Well, that's pretty comprehensive. I don't know what else I could add to that. I will say, when you look at that U.S. embassy over there, it's like a crusader fort. So, it's like, what are they really looking to do with that kind of presence? But yeah, it'll be interesting to watch.
Approve visas. I don't know what you're talking about. They just want to stamp. They need a lot of people to stamp the visas.
Listen, you want to have a good place for everyone to be able to stand around. You don't want it to get too crowded. Someone actually said that to me. Anyway, I don't want to get on the whole thing about U.S. embassies, but no, it's obviously a lot there, a lot to cover. I mean, it was amazing to see the huge number of people who come out. Yeah, tens of thousands. I mean, please, like, just look at the one of those things that's like technically true. Like, yes, if there's a million people there are in fact tens of thousands of people, but the way it looks is something else. But I think it was, clear what was happening. And I saw so many people from all around the world sharing the images of all sorts of political backgrounds. So the impact of Hassan Nasrallah and so many different people of different religions, ideologies, nationalities was very much on display, not just there in Beirut, but I think around the world. So we'll just have to keep following it and keep looking into all of these critical moments and critical pieces as things continue to develop all around the broader region, and of course all interconnected by Israel's desire, backed by the United States, to prevent any form of sovereignty for Arab people. So I think that brings us more or less to the end today. Rania, are there things you would like to remind our listeners about before we leave? I assume they did pretty well on liking the stream because you didn't come back and berate anyone.
Well, the reason I didn't is because we just had so many amazing guests. I didn't get a chance. Let me actually see. I need to hold on. I want to make sure if I need to yell, I will. Sorry. Let me refresh.
Listen, I understand. I wanted to make sure you had that opportunity.
Okay. I mean, I'm okay with the likes for now, given the like to view ratio at this point. So I'll allow it. I'll allow it this week. We'll see about next week. But all that's to say, another thing I want to remind people of is that they can help support Breakthrough News beyond just liking the stream by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a patron. For as little as $5 a month. You can access exclusive merch as well as exclusive content. And most importantly, you can help support independent media at a crucial time. And, I think at some point, Eugene, we need to come up with like a new goal. Like we're really close to 6,000 patrons. Maybe we say, like, if we hit 10,000 patrons, we'll do XYZ. I don't know. Maybe that's the next big thing.
I like
we got to keep growing,
Let's brainstorm, and we're going to come back to you guys with something very exciting to become a patron. More exciting than what you already have, which is already pretty good, if you ask me.
Yeah, I agree. But, it's always good to have more perks.
And you can never have too many. We're like an airline rewards program or something here. You accumulate patrons and you gain things. Except there's no blackouts. And no blackouts and restricted locations.
We won't charge you. And we won't charge you for Wi-Fi.
100%. We will allow you to have free Wi-Fi. We'll also give you, free, better than just one little bag of snacks. Anyway, I could go for an hour on U.S. Airlines. Don't get me started. But,
oh my God,
and the legacy of Jimmy Carter. But anyway, that being said, that'll bring us to the end of our show. Really appreciate all of our guests, as always. Shout out to all of our existing patrons. Thanks to everyone who watched. For myself, for Rania, for the whole BT News team, we will see you next time.